Hello again, and thanks for joining us for this Monday's edition of Alaska Weather. First, hazardous weather graphic showing pretty much advisory watch and warnings free across interior Alaska from the Arctic coast to the North Gulf Coast. But there is a wind chill advisory out until 3 p.m. Tuesday, currently out and remains out until 3 p.m. Tuesday afternoon for Deltana and the Tanana Flats area, including Delta Junction and other locations. And that's for east winds gusting 30 to 35 miles an hour, dropping the wind chill values down to 55 degrees below zero at times. And from there, going to satellite imagery, you can see a lot of cold air in place over much of interior Alaska today, with lows in the down to around minus 30 around the Kenai area, and in the mid-minus 30s across portions of the western Susitna Valley this morning, and down into the mid-minus 40s, Copper River Basin, eastern interior. Coldest location that I saw was minus 57 degrees below zero, or 57 degrees below zero. I guess you could say minus 57. That was at Eagle, and Tok had minus 51.1 degrees below zero at one of the locations there. Otherwise, you can see some clouds spreading onto the western Arctic coast associated with a trough, kind of dropping southward out of the Arctic there, and then another batch moving into Mackenzie Bay, and that kind of grazing the eastern Arctic coast a little bit there. Really not much in the way of any significant weather associated with either of those two areas. And moisture out over the Bering Sea, kind of disorganized clouds. Frontal boundaries try to get organized, but they just kind of go to pieces there. Lying parallel, southeasterly flow, the cold air farther back toward Shemya, west of Shemya actually, and then a winding up little system there in the Gulf of Alaska. That's bringing winds up to 50 miles an hour to the east-northeast in gusts at Middleton Island today, this afternoon, with snow falling the entire day there. So that's turning into a pretty snappy little system there in the Gulf, again with those increasing winds. Otherwise, clear and cold over the Panhandle with gusty outflow winds through the gaps, lighter winds elsewhere. In interior Alaska, a lot of cold temperatures today with some patchy areas of low clouds or fog, but generally not bad. And then some areas of light snow along the central, actually that extended back to the central Arctic coast, some light snow today, and extend over toward Dead Horse and eastward, but not quite making it to Kaktovik and Barter Island. And then a main frontal boundary there, lining it up with the pressure field there with a tighter gradient, of course, in advance of the front, and then a much slacker one behind, so I just drew it there right along the boundary. In advance of that, gusty winds, rain, again, heaviest rainfall occurring at Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, eastern Aleutians, Nikolsky, in those areas, picking up about 0.6 of an inch in the last 24 hours. And otherwise, by comparison, False Pass just to the east had 0.04 of an inch, and St. Paul had 1/100th of an inch of rain as temperatures pushed up around 40 degrees there. And for tonight, chance of snow showers, Kodiak Island into Shelikof Strait, but that'll be pretty light. And snowfall chances increase across Prince William Sound, maybe into Passage Canal, definitely for the North Gulf Coast. And that tries to cross the coast range there into the Copper River Basin, probably only getting up to the Wrangles, though. And otherwise, a place like Gulkana will be a little warmer tonight, but still looking at a forecast low of about 40 below, and 35 to 55 below for the central and eastern interior for the overnight lows, milder out to the west. And chance of snow for the eastern North Slope and Arctic coast is at weak trough drop southward, but it'll get cut off about the crest of the Brooks Range, so areas south of the mountains there won't see anything at all, except maybe some variable clouds possibly spilling southward across the southern slopes. Otherwise, dry for the Panhandle with cold temperatures tonight, especially in the wind-sheltered areas, dropping below zero. And gusty winds, rain, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, For tomorrow, that front pushes eastward, so that'll push the increase in winds and rain will be a little heavier today than it was, or tomorrow than it was today for the Alaska Peninsula. Should be lighter with less wind for the eastern Aleutians, especially in the afternoon if that frontal boundary can get off to the east there a little bit more. And that'll be mostly rain for the Pribilofs. Could be mixed with snow at times, but generally mild conditions continue there. And chances of snow increase over the Copper River Basin, and periods of snow for the North Gulf Coast. I should call it light snow there, possibly, but it could be heavier into the Valdez area. Stays dry and cold over the Panhandle, interior Alaska. A day tomorrow, much like today, except look for some increasing clouds there on the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country streaming northward. And then for Wednesday, not a lot of difference there, except the stronger frontal system. You can see a very tight gradient now across the central and northern Bering Sea. Storm force winds in advance of that front across the Alaska Peninsula. Into Kodiak Island, storm warnings for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island with good gales for St. Lawrence Island, but dry conditions, mostly clear skies there. Stays cold over the northern and central interior. A little milder over southern Alaska, but not too much. Weak trough could bring some light precipitation in the form of snow or maybe snow and rain mixed along the immediate coastline, but some of that up into western Prince William Sound, of course, that'd be in the form of snow into Passage Canal, maybe Whittier, possibly Portage, but right now it doesn't look like a big push of moisture yet coming into there. And that extends over towards Yakutat. Dry, but maybe a little cloudier over the southeast coast, and a little less in the way of wind there as well, and maybe some snow flurries just kind of grazing the central and eastern Arctic coastal areas. And lows tonight, anywhere from 5 below to 15 above for the Panhandle, and 35 to 45 below Copper River Basin, 25 to 35 below Kuskokwim Valley, and again 5 above, or actually 10 above to 30 below. Again, Kenai Peninsula into the Manuscus, the Sitna Valley, and either side of 0 for Bristol Bay. Mid-20s Kodiak, mid-30s for the Kodiak Island tomorrow. Single numbers, South Central Alaska, well below 0, Copper River Basin and areas west of the Alaska Range. Single numbers for the highs, northern Panhandle to, again, near 20, Sitka, Port Alexander. Lows, mid-minus 30s for the Copper River Basin, 20 to 30 below for the Kuskokwim Valley. 2 below to 5 above, Bristol Bay, and below 0 again, South Central Alaska. Highs in the lower to mid-teens for South Central Alaska, a little bit milder, lower 30s Homer, and in the teens to upper 20s for the Panhandle. Up to the north of morning, much like you saw this morning, temperature-wise over the interior, mildest in the west, coldest there in the east. And for highs, about the same, anywhere from 35 to 45 below eastern interior, teens out to the west, followed by lows again, 35 to 45 below. Some areas still pushing 50 below, like Northway and Tok there, Chicken. And then highs, well below 0 again, but above 0, Seward Peninsula. Out to the west, lows down around 0 for the southwest coast, lower 30s though for the Pribilofs, mild southeast flow, looking at lower 40s for the eastern Aleutians. Highs, mid-40s there, lower 40s Adak and Atka, upper 30s Pribilofs and Shimia, lower 40s Alaska Peninsula. Lows below 0 now, down to the southwest coast, right to Nunivak Island, Makoriak, low -1. Highs, lower teens there, and lower to mid-40s for the eastern Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And first line weather graphic for Tuesday morning showing IFR on the increase there and spreading northward from the North Gulf Coast and eastern Prince William Sound, possibly into southern southeastern Copper River Basin to Yakutat. Panhandle, those days VFR with continued offshore flow, and there's some marginal VFR up over the eastern Arctic coast north slope and maybe along the north side of the Brooks Range. Otherwise VFR, northern Bering Sea, right on down to the southwest coast and beyond. Pick up some marginal VFR for the Pribilofs. And then IFR, western Alaska Peninsula westward to Amchitka Island and extending northwestward for the afternoon. We'll see that area thins out there, a little thinner IFR band now from just the eastern Aleutians and northwestward, now lifting north of the Aleutians. Some marginal VFR still clinging to the AKwx area, Pribilof's marginal, and Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, northern Bering Sea, VFR right up into the Chukchi Sea and much of the Arctic coast. Still some marginal VFR over toward Kaktovik and Barter Island, as well as the eastern North Slope. IFR still along the North Gulf Coast with southerly flow trying to push that through the coast range, some of which may get into the southern Copper River Basin. Marginal VFR up to the southern slopes of the eastern Alaska Range, and the Panhandle stays good VFR as well as Kodiak Island. And then Wednesday morning, Kodiak into marginal VFR northward there into Kamishak Bay. IFR's continuing to dissipate slowly, but still over the eastern Aleutians, southern coast of the western Alaska Peninsula, and even the marginal VFR now lifting north of the area from Adak westward to Shimianet too. Pribilof stay marginal, and southern Copper River Basin still has a chance of IFR there with some marginal VFR up toward the eastern Alaska Range. Prince William Sound into Passage Canal and possibly as far west as Portage could see IFR conditions Wednesday morning. Good VFR for the remainder of interior Alaska, now all the way out to the Arctic coast. Panhandle, another VFR day coming up there through Wednesday afternoon. Even Yakutat VFR in the afternoon. And some possible IFR, western Prince William Sound down to Resurrection Bay, and along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range to Kamishak Bay. Togiak Bay in the southwest mountains, IFR, and a band now across the southern Bering Sea, pushing in across the Pribilof Islands. St. Lawrence Island, northward and eastward, all VFR. Tuesday, Anatuvik Pass, marginal VFR, trending toward VFR in the afternoon, but Adigan probably occasionally marginal throughout the day. Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR, as is rainy. Windy, VFR. Isabel, trending toward marginal VFR, especially on the southern entrance through the afternoon. Mentasta, marginal. Tanita, or VFR for Tanita. And Portage, marginal VFR becoming IFR at some point in the afternoon, especially toward evening. Chilkoot and White, probably another day or two of, well, will be 2 more days of VFR there for Chilkoot and White passes. Freezing levels, 8,000 feet almost up to the eastern Aleutians, 2,000 feet right up to the Russian coastline there, 6,000 feet to the Pribilof Islands. And icing, increasing chances of icing along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, with that low and southerly flow pushing that moisture northward onto the coast and a little beyond. And could be some considerable moderate rime icing areas of there for the eastern Aleutians, but that lifting north of the Aleutians and the heaviest stuff staying south and west of the Pribilofs. Jet stream showing upper level low over the eastern interior at 33,000 feet, northeast 100 knots over the north slope, and then westerlies 115 to 130 knots from the southwest interior into the Gulf, and south 115 knots over the central Aleutians, 9,000 feet. South to southeast flow, 35 to 55 knots, eastern Aleutians into the central Bering Sea. And then the low there, south of Montague Island, southerlies up to 50 knots coming into the eastern North Gulf Coast and over the Wrangell Mountains. Northerlies, 35 to 40 knots over the Panhandle. And 3,000 feet, east winds 45 knots along the mid-Yukon River Valley and the western Brooks Range area, Noatak Valley, 65 knots there for the southeast Bering Sea. Turbulence, considerable moderate turbulence, mechanical variety, Prince William Sound, northern Panhandle, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians.
Welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today, I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRAS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRAS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRAS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies. Maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations, and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 to 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices, and so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across like large spaces or even small cities. So I noticed here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations. And you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes, and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad, and this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch, and I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRa's. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRa's. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great, yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis shows continued westward progression of the sea ice from the west coast there, especially heading towards St. Lawrence Island along the Yukon Delta coast, and also along the south side of Nunivak Island. And it'll continue for the next 4 or 5 days with strong east and northeast winds. Will continue to advance it to the west, especially north of Nunivak Island, and to a lesser extent down toward Bristol Bay. And from there, coastal water forecasts looking something like this. For the south coast, east winds 15 knots, seas 5 feet. Small craft advisories on the north coast. East-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the day Tuesday. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northern inner channels, north winds 30 to 40 knots, and northeast 25 and gusty for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait. Southeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Outlook for Wednesday, winds come down in the northern inner channels there, 25 knots out of the north, especially for Lynn Canal, northeast 25 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, southeast 20 knots, and small craft advisories along all the coastlines, south coast out of the east at 30 knots, north coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots, seas 13 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. And eastern North Gulf Coast, south side of that low center, winds will be west at 20 knots there across Middleton Island. And then the western North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 15 knots, same forecast for the Barren Islands. Kamishak Bay and southern Cook Inlet looking at northeast winds on Tuesday at 25 knots, northern Cook Inlet northeast at 10. And for Wednesday, pretty good increase in the winds, all areas. Small craft advisories, northern Cook Inlet, north winds 25 knots, seas in the ice-free waters up to 6 feet. Southern Cook Inlet, good gales at northeast 40 knots, seas 11 feet. Kamishak Bay, northeast at 45 knots. Barren Islands, east winds 45 knots. North Gulf Coast, gale warnings, east-southeast winds 40 knots, seas 17 to 21 feet. Small craft advisories for Prince William Sound. 6-foot seas with a north northeast wind at 25 knots. Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds 15 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, east winds 35 to 40 knots and northeast winds at 30 for Bristol Bay. And we've got storm warnings coming into the forecast here. All the Alaska Peninsula, east winds 50 knots, seas 17 to 21 feet. And Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds 40 to 45 knots, so full gales there, and east winds 50 knots, good for storm warnings for Bristol Bay. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, east to southeast winds 30 to 45 knots, east-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians, and northwest 15 to 20 western Aleutians. And then on Wednesday, west-southwest 30 knots for the western Aleutians, Adak and Atka, southwest 20 to 25 knots. And the eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds 20 to 35 knots with seas running 12 to 16 feet. Southwest coast, east winds 30 knots, east winds 30 knots, St. Lawrence Island. Gale warning, St. Matthew Island, east at 40. Pribilos, east 45 knots there with 18-foot seas. For Wednesday, storm warnings for the Pribilofs, east winds 50 knots, storm warnings for the St. Matthew Island area, northeast winds 55 knots, seas 30 feet, storm warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, east at 50 knots, and for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, full gales out of the northeast at 45 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tonight, north winds 10 to 15 knots. Central coast, northeast at 10. Western Arctic coast, east 15 to 25 knots. And Wales to Cape Lisbon, or from Wales to up to Cape Thompson, northeast at 20. And then for Wednesday, 30-knot winds out of the southwest for the central Arctic coast. The east side, looking at west and southwest winds of 20 to 25 knots. For tonight, look for some snow, light snow, fog for the eastern Arctic coast, advancing southward to about the crest of the central and eastern Brooks Range. Another clear, cold night, well below zero over most of interior Alaska, but milder out toward the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island areas. Snow on the increase, slowly, light snow for the North Gulf Coast into the Coast Range there, possibly the Wrangell Mountains. And for Tuesday, rain and gusty winds for the Alaska Peninsula, and snow for the Copper River Basin into Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast. And the next day, that strong wind zone advances into Kodiak Island with rain heavy at times, clear and cold over interior Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.